You're listening to the Flex Success podcast, where we teach you how to be less shit.
I'm your co-host Lizzy, and this is Dean. We'll be covering all topics relating to health, fitness, and bodybuilding.
Join us as we use our in the trenches experience and up-to-date science to provide you with information that you can actually use.
If you like what we do, be sure to give us a like, follow, share, and tag us on social media.
Boys, welcome back for part 2 of Peak Week. How are we?
Very good, thank you, Liz. How are you?
Can't complain.
I'm very well. We're back in Buenos Aires after a week in Paraguay, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, so Paraguay went for a little bit longer than we anticipated because our flight got cancelled. But on the extra day that we had there, Dean and I decided to go for a walk just to listen to our audiobooks and get some steps in. We were walking in no particular direction and we came across a cemetery with actual human bones just hanging out of coffins. It was wild. That was so crazy.
Ridiculous.
The contrast of it was wild because it was like a cemetery of basically, they're called mausoleums.
Above ground tombs. I don't know what they're called.
Yeah. And there was the wall of just caskets, basically, like people that couldn't really afford a hell of a lot. And then there were the actual like proper mausoleums, which were like, there was one that I sent a picture to a friend of mine to check this out. They're like, oh, that's a nice house. I was like,
it looks like a church, doesn't it? But it was just housing 2 coffins.
And around the corner, there was literally just empty coffins with bones.
Of course,
so I took a video of it. Go on.
Of course, they're not being used now, but like, imagine back at the time where that just happened. They just dump a body in there, and you live nearby. Like, the smell.
I don't know. I hadn't considered it. I thought that, like, at the time, I assumed they had concealed it properly, and just over the course of time, it had kind of broken down, the coffin and the body. Yeah, and I took a video of it and I sent it to a Paraguayan girl that I made friends with. Hi, Angel, if you're listening. And she said that the families of the dead people can't afford to keep paying the upkeeping fees to the cemetery. So that particular tomb gets abandoned, and therefore the coffin and the body inside is vulnerable to people looking for human bones to do witchcraft with, which is apparently like still going on in Paraguay.
Yeah, because I would say they all have come out of a coffin from some, because there were some of the mausoleums were like obviously not kept and like almost had been used as storage for paint containers and stuff.
Yeah, it was weird.
Some that were very well kept. And then this particular wall was literally like, if you think of like in a movie where you see a morgue where someone just gets like rolled into like a little like section, like
shelf.
What it was like, Liz, like a
drawer. They get the dead bodies go into drawer.
Yeah, but like a hotel, like the hotels in Japan that you can stay in, just
capsule hotel.
So it was just like that, but they were obviously all damaged, and yeah,
it was crazy. And Dean and I were pointing out like, oh, that's a scapula, that's a metal, that's a femur. It was a little anatomy lesson, wasn't it?
Just for shits and gigs, put a big clump of hair in one of them that was also next to a skull.
Yeah, I don't know if it was for shits and gigs. I don't know how long it takes for hair to break down, but there was like a bunch of hair next to a skull inside an open casket. It was creepy. Anyways, to the point of today's episode, we are continuing on from Peak Weeks. Part 1, we were talking about different carb loading strategies. Now we're going to talk about other considerations in Peak Week outside of carbohydrates. And by we, I mean the boys, Coach George and Coach Dean. Again, I'm just here to moderate and crack badges. So the subtopics that we have jotted down that the boys are going to talk about is we're going to talk about other macronutrient changes other than carbohydrates. So how are we going to change protein and fats? We're going to talk about fluid manipulation and non-spicy supplements, meaning supplementation outside of steroids. Beginning with, shall we start with macronutrient changes, Dean and George, outside of carbohydrates?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's the most logical, bigger chunk of the week to start with. So outside of carbohydrate loading, we can typically look at the other sides of the weeks, whether it be the start, end point, or like one day out, as days we'd call fat load days, following this typical approach. And what this would conceive of would be days of lower carbohydrate amount, whether that means trace next to zero or just a lower amount than your typical daily carbohydrate intake, with an increase in typically protein and fats alongside that. The thought process here has a couple of different positives and reasons as to why we would want to do it. First obvious one would be a lower carbohydrate environment, whether low or zero, would drive insulin sensitivity up and essentially prime you ready for carbohydrates to come later in the week. A second component there would be, if we think about the internal balloon that is the muscle belly, everyone often thinks and attests to intramuscular glycogen stores, but at times we often forget that there is a very much so small space, but still a space nonetheless contributed to intramuscular triglycerides. And if we truly want to achieve 100% fullness, we must think about the other components inside the muscle as well. So a part of that very small moderate of the first probably fat load day would really achieve this, but we're going to start to drive intracellular triglyceride stores up, and that is obviously going to aid in a component of the finished look, during which time the macronutrients being increased from protein and fats would somewhat in turn increase thermogenesis and the thermic effect of digesting food. And that can support an essence of diuresis in that process as well. So you can think of it like a fat load would almost be replicant of a depletion prior to the carb loading. But yeah, primes you ready for the carbs, pays the homage to some essence of the fullness, but then I believe it to you for protein.
Yeah, but then also on that, I think that paper that we shared last podcast that talks about fat loading in there too. There was a bit of, when it first came out, there was a bit of a push towards like fat loading being this specific approach to take to give a given look. Those things that you just mentioned there too. But what it also is doing is, by virtue of wanting to raise calories to decrease stress, you have to raise them from something other than carbohydrates if you're not going to be carbohydrate loading at maintenance calories for the entirety of the week, which is likely not going to happen. So by virtue of wanting to raise calories to decrease stress, you have to raise a macronutrient. And in the absence of carbohydrates, you can only do protein so far. So by virtue of that, you end up with higher fats as well. So it's a bit of a default diet, I think, sometimes too. The other consideration is protein. By no means will you ever be protein loading for a particular look. But you certainly can leverage protein for various reasons. And then there's also the consideration as to like why you don't maybe need protein a lot. So on days whereby you are not loading carbohydrates and you want to be at maintenance calories and you are fat loading, you have the consideration of low food volume. So you may still be relatively hungry. So having a little bit more protein in there may drive a bit more satiety. So there's that win. And then also a high protein, high fat, low carbohydrate environment, like George just mentioned, is also somewhat supportive or biases diuresis. So you've got some fluid balance control there. The other side or flip of that coin is, when you are carbohydrate loading, you do not need a significant amount of protein in order to support the carbohydrate loading. So you can actually decrease your protein amounts to a minimum effective dose. You could look at this as either doing a total protein consumption for the day as being the minimum effective, and it might be something like, anywhere between 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram through till 2.5 grams of protein per kilo. It could go higher, but typically you don't need to. Or you could think of it actually on a meal by meal basis, whereby you want to give yourself a sufficient amount of protein to at least stimulate muscle protein synthesis so that it's a sufficient protein bolus. But you don't need any more than that then technically every 4-ish hours to cover that off if you're worried about, for whatever reason, losing muscle. Not that you would, but that minimum effective dose is going to be like somewhere around the sort of 30 to 40 grams of protein coming from a direct animal source. And the reason why you'd also want to bring your protein down from an animal source to do that is to give yourself more space and more calories for carbohydrate loading. Because if you leave protein neutral and then you add in 500, 600, 700 grams of carbohydrates, you can actually like pull the calories down a tiny bit, in preference for not driving a massive calorie surplus during a carbohydrate load by bringing the protein down. So I typically will bring protein down to a minimum dose of like 35 grams per meal, 4 to 5 meals per day on a carbohydrate load day. And then on the other days, I'd consider probably keeping that protein higher.
Okay, cool. Dan, you just mentioned from an animal source a couple of times when you were talking about protein. Do you just mean because usually protein comes from animal sources, or are you somehow differentiating protein that comes from animal sources and protein that comes from, like, I don't know, beans or something like that?
Yeah.
Whole
So, yeah, I'll specify, if somebody was just trying to put this into application, that I want the 30 to 35 grams of protein to come directly from an animal source, because I know by doing that, you will also then be giving yourself sufficient amino acids that do stimulate muscle protein synthesis namely leucine in your branched chain and essential amino acids. So you like cover off the minimum effective dose. And then anything you pick up on top of that is just extra, from rice, beans, whatever you mentioned, those vegetables. If we did just 35 grams total protein, you may run into like a protein-based meal that is sufficient in total protein, but not sufficient in total amino acid profile. Because like, for example, I don't know why I always remember this number, but to get the same amount of leucine from a wheat-based sort of source as what you would from an animal source, you need 100 grams of protein from wheat, which you'd never do. Like, it's not possible, but it kind of like just tells you, like, to get the same leucine as what you would from, say, 35 grams of protein coming from beef. So you'd have to eat a lot of calories and a lot of wheat to get the MPS that you're looking for.
Right.
So yeah, usually it's going to come from like either just one source or multiple sources.
Okay. Right. And so if you had a client who was like a vegetarian, for example, there would be a way around it, like adding a leucine supplement to a meal with, did I say vegan or vegetarian?
Same.
Vegetarian. Okay. With eggs and beans or something like that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. You could be fortifying each meal if you wanted to. I would argue though, like, if you're in a carbohydrate loading day, the calories are going to be sufficient enough that it's probably not that big of a deal, to be honest. But yes, if we're talking technically speaking, if you want it to be perfect, I would fortify the meal.
Okay, cool. So as far as changes to fats and protein are concerned, because they're the only two remaining macronutrients outside of carbohydrates, any other points before we move on to food choices?
No, not from a macronutrient perspective.
Okay, maybe I have a question on fat loading then. So we spoke about how if someone wants to front load or back load or do undulating carb loading, how they might go about choosing the amount of carbohydrates. So same here, Dean, you gave us some numbers on protein. I think you said 30 to 35 grams of protein per meal, 3 to 5 meals a day, if I'm remembering correctly. What about fat loading? How might someone choose how many grams of fat to have for their fat load?
Well, because the data on actually what it takes to load intramuscular triglycerides supports it being so low, like 2% of the total storage, you're going to achieve the goal of triglyceride loading pretty quickly with probably 1 to 2 meals. It's not going to take a lot if they're high in fats. The main consideration comes down to total calorie considerations and what you're trying to do with the net goal of the peak. If you're trying to leverage this person into a deficit, then you'd have to look at the total calorie amount and consider where the fats then go based on that consideration to keep them with the main background goal of that peak week. Whereas if you want to keep them at maintenance, you just bring the total fats up in respect to the energy intake, providing that you're not manipulating protein.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to give an example to the audience. So let's say somebody has a 3,000 calorie target and, the coach has decided that they need 250 grams of protein within that day. That leaves 2,000 calories remaining. Quick math. There's 4 calories per gram of protein. If there's 250 grams of protein, 1,000 calories, not hard. So you would then determine, okay, we've got 2,000 calories left. How would you guys then decide, if you're doing a fat load, how many of those calories to give to carbs and how many of those calories to give to fats?
First thing I'd tick off is fiber intake requirements. So fruit and veg, get all that hit to baseline, also the requirements expected of the day. Then you're left with that deduction from the calorie amount to then decide on carbs and fats. If the individual perhaps is coming into peak week, perhaps not too far away from a refeed or had baseline food for a little while, perhaps you're going to want to deplete them a little bit harder on carbohydrates. So perhaps it makes sense to run trace carbohydrates, in which case all of the total remaining calories would then go over to fats. If the individual was... So you get it?
I just said, okay. Like, yeah, I'm listening.
Yeah, so and then on the flip side of that, if you wanted to roll reverse and you had an individual who didn't need to deplete or run off as hard, you could potentially leverage them to have slightly higher food. With the example you used with 3,000 calories as a target, they probably aren't going to be running trace carbohydrates because the fats to hit that amount would be quite high and digestion would probably get a little bit of a brunt of hit there.
Okay.
Yeah, that was going to be my only follow-up comment, is that even though on paper you may want to hit maintenance calories at trace carbohydrates with X amount of protein, that it might mean that you then are at like 200 grams of fat per day, and that may not be digestively that well tolerated. So, you can just slowly work your way towards a higher fat content with a moderate carbohydrate content, for example. The only thing I would say is that it's probably advantageous for most individuals to just evenly distribute those fats across the day, as opposed to loading them into 1 or 2 meals heavily, and then, you know, whatever it may be. So
Okay, so just to put some definitions, by whatever it may be or digestively uncomfortable, the boys are talking about shitting yourself, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
just so
or
we're
not,
clear.
or not. Either or way.
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
slippery poison.
And by trace carbohydrates, you guys are talking about just the carbs in vegetables and fruit with no other carbohydrates also.
Yes.
Okay.
The one though, just to add on the peak week point of calories there. So when we say like trying to achieve like calorie maintenance across the week, Deem's right there. You don't have to try and hit that with fat loading. You could look at the average weekly calories as the net goal of the week. So if you do have slightly lower on your fat load days, you're inevitably going to have a lower calorie amount on a fat load day than on a carb load day if your carb load is sufficient enough. So you're going to have to make that balance out for the total net at the end of the week towards your goal, whether surplus, deficit, or maintenance.
Right. Okay.
The other thing too is that you don't necessarily have to go to trace carbohydrates to be depleted. Like, one, you're already generally entering peak week depleted because you've been eating insufficient calories and therefore insufficient carbohydrates for a long period of time. And then you have the other consideration is that your body utilizes carbohydrates for some certain functions like brain function that you cannot eradicate. So, you know, eating somewhere in the vicinity of 80 to 100 grams of carbohydrates in a day is what I could probably classify as like a muscle glycogen deficit, but not necessarily like a full depletion of all carbohydrates, you know. So it doesn't have to be zero or just trace most of the time.
And if people are training as well?
This is the
Well,
thing.
yeah. Okay, cool. All right, so let's move on to food choices now. We've spoken about macronutrients in part 1, carbohydrates, in part 2, fat and protein. But let's say somebody's like, okay, I'm at the stage now where I've decided if I'm front loading or back loading, where my fat load's going to be, how much protein I'm going to have. I'm going to go ahead and write the diet to these macros. How might they go about choosing the foods to put into their diet?
Yeah. So, you know, point number 1, we've kind of touched on this previously, is that use food sources that you're already familiar with and have all been eating at least for a while. I actually just thought of one caveat to that loading strategy is that if you're somebody who has actually been very, very low carbohydrate for a very long time, going straight into a full load overnight may not be advantageous because you do downregulate some of the enzymatic functions required for carbohydrate digestion and assimilation. So there may be a period where you actually want to slowly ramp your carbohydrates back up. So just as a caveat to this conversation. But one thing that I think is largely missed in the bodybuilding industry, because there is still this inherent idea that fruit is bad for you for some reason, that adding a fructose source of some description to your carbohydrate loading meals or to your meals that include carbohydrates, like so that they're co-ingested together, is absolutely unequivocally advantageous for glycogen storage. So if you want to maximize your return on investment from your carbohydrate loading from like George said before, like a balloon reserve perspective, you should be adding some fructose to your meals.
Okay. And so what might be the fruits that you could add to your meals that would give you that fructose load without having like a mountain of strawberries, for example?
Well, I mean, there's also some vegetables as well that contain fructose, obviously typically in lower amounts. But if you looked at the daily net total, you wouldn't necessarily have to be too specific with your fruit selection to get a pretty decent enough bolus of fructose across the day. Some general mixed berries, banana, apple, kiwis, just general recommendations of your normal colors will tick off the box.
Okay.
Consideration in fruit intake and how you achieve fruit, and thus also fiber in this consideration across the peak week. Sometimes if you're trying to make weight with an individual, total food volume and total food weight has to be equated, and by potentially manipulating your fruit from fresh raw fruit to a dried fruit, you can bring down total weight, and of course fluid obviously within that dehydration process drops out, so that can help you manipulate the weight coming down with keeping fiber consistent without necessarily having to do what some people do, which is typically decreasing fiber, which I've only ever personally experienced to get a backlash from and never actually work efficiently or properly. It always comes with a negative if you try and change your fiber too high up or too down, just for that matter.
Okay.
And the other thing too, Liz, just before you jump in, is that fructose isn't isolated within just fruit. It is also found in things like jams and even honeys, because they have, or any, even to be fair, table sugar being sucrose is part fructose, part glucose. So you can leverage if fruit, for example, is like your fiber's too high, or you don't want any additional like fiber coming in on top of things, you could use things like jam on rice cakes, and that will give you a portion of it too. Generally speaking, I aim for somewhere in the sort of like 10 to 20 grams of carbohydrates coming from a fruit per carbohydrate meal. That will generally cover that off too. You don't need a lot. You only need a small margin of fructose to aid in this sort of maximum glycogen replenishment or saturation perspective.
So going off those numbers, that's like half to one average banana.
Yeah, and like that's a great comment, right? And the comment that George made before about dried fruit is that I could give somebody 25 grams of apricot, or I could give them 250 grams of berries, depending on the berry of choice. And now they may want the 250 grams of berry because maybe the volume of that food is still quite low and they still need the fiber. Maybe they need to put in a ton of carbohydrates, but we still want them to give them fructose. So there's some individual now considerations as to why you would go for dried fruit over fresh fruit, why you would go for a jam over, an actual piece of fruit.
Yeah, just for people who might be confused about the dried fruit, fresh fruit comment, I just want to expand on that quickly or explain it. So it's not necessarily that dried fruit is somehow magically higher in this or that. It's that dried fruit has gone through a dehydration process where the moisture, the non-caloric moisture within that food has been taken out. So a banana that previously weighed 100 grams and has X amount of fructose and fiber and whatever in it, that same banana with those same calories and fructose and other micronutrients has now been minimized to maybe 20 grams because the moisture is taken out of it. So that's the difference here between fresh fruit and dried fruit.
Yep. So you got a consideration and a double win there, and you've got food volume in the actual stomach in regards to tolerating the size of the meal from a digestive perspective, but you also have weight on the scale, like George mentioned, if you are somebody who's maybe trying to, edge under a weight category. So maybe we're starting to now manipulate food volume for weight purposes. You also, even from a food choice perspective here, need to consider, as we just discussed then, like the fluid volume. So if you're somebody who's, drinking fairly consistent fluid and then you decide to just solely carbohydrate load on rice cakes for whatever reason and jam, and then you don't add in some additional fluid, you may actually find it difficult to get the maximum replenishment from that because carbohydrates require fluid in regards for them to be stored as glycogen. And then inversely to that, like if you decided to load solely on cream of rice and you're somebody who uses 5 times the amount of water than you do rice flour, you've now just gone and increased your fluid intake by maybe 2.5 liters a day, which is huge for most people. The same could be said for rice and or pasta, but it's my experience that the amount of fluid that those foods hold in them once cooked is actually relatively similar to what you probably need to facilitate maximum glycogen replenishment. So you kind of don't have to worry about it. I account for it just because I'm interested. But for most people, if you're just having a little bit of extra rice or a little bit extra pasta, probably not a problem. If you're loading on cream of rice, consider the fluids. If you're loading solely on rice cakes, also consider the fluids.
Okay, so glycogen being stored carbohydrates within the muscle, but it's carbohydrate fluid. So for every gram of carbohydrate, there needs to be, 3 or 4 grams of fluid.
Yeah.
So Dean, what you're saying is if you're just eating carbs and there's no water, like the glycogen, we're not going to get that glycogen saturation that you're wanting.
You'll still get it. You just end up at a net deficit from a hydration perspective.
Okay.
Just to take the extreme example, let's just say you loaded somebody on 500 grams of carbohydrates after they've been on 0 and they drink 3 liters of fluid, right? And that additional 500 grams of carbohydrates technically requires about 2 liters of fluid for it to be stored. It's not like you won't store it. You have the capacity to store it. Like your body does shit for you, right? But that previous, I can't remember how much fluid I said, 4 liters of fluid that you were consuming now is being redistributed, let's just say, to help facilitate that replenishment. And you may end up noticing things like that your urination rate actually goes down quite significantly. And then your actual, first piss of the morning is actually quite yellow. It's like, oh, hang on a minute, you've actually driven a level of dehydration acutely here by loading carbohydrates. Like, oh, light bulb, maybe I could actually do this to a degree at some point in the week if I wanted to. But also, if you want to really like keep everything's neutral, so you don't have to worry about things like skewing and hydration skewing, you should probably push a little bit of extra fluid in. I don't think it's necessary though to necessarily. I hate saying that to match it. You know, like I don't think because you're having 500 grams, you should have an extra 2 liters. I think covering it by about 50% is generally enough. You know, if you want to consider fluid intake with carbohydrates.
There's a prime example of the water carb situation when you look at athletes right on show day where they're coming in a little flat and they're eating all the food in the world and they're not really filling up. And then after the comp, after the show, they'll chug about 2 liters of water and all of a sudden they come to life. Vascularity goes through the roof and all of a sudden it starts to look like it's done something. Yeah, just a prime example right there, that carb fluid relationship.
I think this is just a prime example of people that know enough, they've collected the information, they think they know what they're doing, and they just miss something small, or that's seemingly small, like drinking enough water, that can make all the difference, and why you need a good coach to make sure you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's, and not dotting your T's and crossing your I's.
It also sounds a little bit overkill when you say to some people the level of stuff that we track for peak week, but it is all necessary to pick it apart and know, like, if something does start to go a little bit west or a little bit of a different response to what we're normally used to, and you have made a change, you can pick that change out and then you can reverse it if it goes away or the look changes in a way you don't like. You know where it is, isolate the problem, fix. But if you're not tracking these things or keeping on top of them, you don't know what to do or what to change.
Yeah.
I also just realized that I probably need to asterisk this real quickly for a myth that is out there that needs to be fucking eradicated, because it may have sounded like I was saying you could do this. And that is that loading on what people would classify as, yes, I will say this with a massive smirk on my face, dry carbohydrates, being those that require fluid. Like, for example, if you were to eat dry oats, good fucking luck, for one. But two, that doesn't mean that it's going to specifically pull fluid from the subcutaneous space or the interstitial space. So one, you can't choose, but it just means that you will be at like somewhat of a sort of generally sort of reduced hydration status, but it won't change the look in regards to dryness for show day. That's not how it works. And if anything, generally, if you were to drive dehydration, you have then the considerations for what will happen with fluid retention if you don't catch that quick enough in regards to sodium and that too. So dry carbohydrate loading is bullshit. Don't do it.
I just want to ask where this might have come from, because often people have the, myths come from something that superficially makes sense. But if you just look a centimeter closer, you're like, haha, that's hilarious. Is the whole I'm going to eat dry oats to give my body a drier look for competition? Does it come from this? People think they eat oats, the water in their body or something like is attracted to the dry oats. Is that the idea? Not realizing that like digestive fluid.
Perhaps it's the placebo that the dry oats are just eradicating any essence of saliva from their mouth, and they're mistaking that dryness is the rest of their body changing.
Maybe.
There's an asterisk for this, and I think you might be shocked to hear this, but it was made aware to me after a long time of having oats in a client's plan that Lexi, and I'm shouting and calling you out on this, eats her oats fucking dry.
For pleasure.
Her excuse here is that she mixes her berries up warm in the microwave, melts them down, and then chucks them in and then mix it all in, and it kind of goes like a flapjack. There is no component in this making it sticky, and the oats are not hard and crispy like a flapjack. It's just dry oats.
Is this her preference?
This is her preference. This is how she likes to eat.
It's not like a health thing.
No, there's no reason other than just pure enjoyment. Psychopath behavior.
The only version of oats dry that is delicious is granola.
Toasted.
It has fat in it.
But you know what? Oh,
no, but yeah.
I'm not trying to stick up for the psychopathic behavior because I believe it's odd. Hi, Lexi. But sometimes when you get frozen berries, they can be really liquidy, and it's quite a sweet liquid. So if it's like really liquidy and the oats are soaking up that sweetness, I don't know.
Dry oats are still
fucking
chewy, man. Like they're not actually that palatable.
Know how many berries she has in her plan? Like that amount of berries is not the right relationship to those oats. That's dry.
Tell me the ratio of oat to berry.
I'd have to pull it up. I'm pretty sure it's somewhere around like the 100 to 100.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, damn. No, 100.
That's a lot of berry to oat.
No, it's not. 100 berries to 100 oats.
Oh, I'm thinking 100 cooked oats. Sorry, 100 dry oats. Shit. Yeah.
At one point, it was
That's
there. Yeah.
that's a lot of oats. That's
No,
what, like 250
It was.
cooks.
She was up to like 3,100 calories a day. That was good. I like that. Obviously.
Damn.
no, Lisa, I think it comes from a logical fallacy, right? I feel like it makes sense if you just say it without thinking. Like, I eat carbohydrates that need water. If they need water, they have to get them from somewhere.
My
Therefore,
body. Yeah.
will make them drier. I think
Yeah,
that's,
but just look 1 centimeter closer and see why that's ridiculous.
I know, but I'm just saying it's the logical fact. And I think wonder if there's also like some like associated misjudgment of reality in that bodybuilders at the end of the peak week will use things like rice cakes, which are dry, but then they'll also pull fluid, and then they'll also use diuretics, and you know,
Okay.
kind of like this, you know, this few things like are starting to go together, and they just go, oh, this is the reason. But it's
Right.
Yeah.
And the guy at the gym that's a bit more shredded than me told me to do it. Therefore, I should do it.
It wasn't the Lasix or the Moduretic. It was the dry rice cakes that dried this individual out.
yeah.
Yes. Logical conclusion.
It was the fish that made my skin look thin. Have you heard this one?
Yeah.
Shut the fuck up, everyone. Please stop. Please read a book.
It's not the fact that you ate fish for the last 6 weeks while also still in a deficit and got leaner. Yeah.
When
Oh,
it came to fish, it just made such a difference. Like, it just removed all dietary fats, essentially. It's a big calorie drop.
yeah. Oh my God. Okay, so let's talk about potassium foods. Why might we choose them? How might we decide which ones to eat, how much to eat? Go.
The electrolytes are important for peak week because they help manage fluid balance and fluid homeostasis in the body. Now, the main thing to remember is that the body is always going to be fighting back to homeostasis. So whatever we do, whatever changes we make, you're essentially starting off a chain of events that are essentially going to fight against the action you're typically pushing into play. If we're trying to push diuresis, at some point that pendulum's going to swing back to aeresis and vice versa. When loading, at some point your body's going to crank up fluid depletion. So the main bulk of why we'd potentially want to keep an eye on potassium and sodium is because they're the main two players that are interesting for us when we're thinking about if there was a way to create this net environment for shifting one way or the other. It's a very simple, easy manipulation. We can just decrease one side of the relationship or increase one side of the relationship to drive it in whichever direction we wanted. But there is some considerations for like a difference in fullness and look when individuals have a certain amount of potassium and sodiums in their physique. And you typically see this across the prep change based on your food source changes. But I try to stick like a minimum of say 3 to 4 grams of potassium and then obviously sodium to suit their look, depending on the individual for most. And then some of my bigger guys, some of my heavier guys would then escalate that up. Naturally, it goes up with higher food requirements, but typically somewhere around like that 6, 7, or even like 8, 9 mark. It depends on the size of the individual and if they have like a high output job and stuff like this. So the potential choices of food sources here, like proteins are a good source of potassium, cruciferous vegetables, green leafy vegetables, and as we mentioned earlier, the dried fruits, so things like dried apricots also contain quite a high amount of potassium. They may be efficacious to help drive a certain degree of look change depending on what your goal is. And if you're decreasing or changing total intakes, moving from like a fat load to a carb load day, you may be taking things out of play from those nutritional sources that would affect your potassium sodium levels. So you may need to then replace that with some of these high choices to keep that consistent.
Yep. Last line is the take-home message for everybody there is that most of your foods will probably cover you off as long as you don't fuck around with them too much. But if you are going to swing from macronutrient to macronutrient, and by virtue of doing that, you have to switch out food types, you may be doing this without even knowing and unknowingly shifting fluid balance that you then don't have the opportunity to catch later on because you didn't even know it happened. And like George said, there's always a trail. You know, you push it in one direction, it'll come back the other. It's usually like on a 24 to 48 hour turnaround period, maybe up to 72 hours, depending on it. So if you make a change 3 days out and you haven't known that you've made said change because you've just shifted some food choices, then there is a potential there that you're going to catch the reverse too early or too late. So yeah, nailed.
And a lot of noise on the scale, I imagine, and people freaking out that weight has changed and they think, oh, I've lost muscle or fat or something like that. But really, it was just potassium change.
pretty live example, and then reversing of the situation when you look at athletes making peak week, making weight on peak week. So, sodium manipulation or electrolyte manipulation could be a really crucial way of flushing fluid and depleting them into their weight cap if they're just hovering around it close within proximity to do so safely. But then on the flip side of that, once you kind of get fluid homeostasis back in line and some carbs flowing back in the mix, their muscularity and their body fat has not changed. They just dropped off fluid and then regain their fluid back.
Yeah, this is the one that if you skew it too far without knowing is going to cause the worst look without you even being able to fix it. But I think one of the important things to note with what George said, again, just to reiterate this, is that if you shift it in one direction and a look starts to be achieved that you like, if you don't continue to try and shift it in the same direction repeatedly so it's still novel, then that's when you'll get the rebound effect that's problematic. So a quick example of this would be if you shift sodium down momentarily or fluid up in order to drive diuresis to get to weight, and then you don't continue that diuresis happening at a rate that is sufficient to maintain that deficit somewhat, then there will be a period where your body goes, uh-oh, like sodium is low. What do I do in order to get this back into balance? Like sodium balance in fluid is to then retain fluid. So if you end up like not shifting fluid upwards in a consistent fashion in this particular instance, you would then get a rebound of fluid retention, and it will probably happen before you want it to happen. So you do have to be semi-cautious of that.
Okay, cool. And this is something you guys track in your clients' peak week diets?
Yes. And then it's compounded for people that are considering two other things. One, if you're going to use actual pharmaceutical diuretics, it's potentially compounded depending on your choices there, in that you may retain potassium and lose sodium, or you may lose both, depending the choice. If you are somebody who also then likes to load carbohydrates with exogenous insulin use, there's an impact of that on potassium too. So now you have to think about that. And then if you're even somebody who's been using clenbuterol long-term, that also has a potassium impact. So like, as I've said this so many times, that most of the time doing as little as possible to these things is the best thing that you can do. But don't think that you can do all of these things and it won't come without consequence.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in that people will just think, again, like simply they might go, oh, well, I need to load carbohydrates and I need to load it in a small window. I've pushed fluid out because I needed to make weight. And the only way I'm going to get carbohydrate fullness back now is to load with insulin or whatever it may be. And it's like, oh, you just create this environment where your electrolytes are so fucking skewed, you've got no chance of landing that properly unless you really know what you're doing. And these things are like finely controlled. You are certainly not God, and you certainly cannot beat the body. You can try and like nudge it in the right direction, but the further you nudge it also, the further it'll punch back usually. So like you only just need to like slightly deviate in a certain direction. You don't need to go from like George's numbers before, like say 4,000 potassium, 4,000 sodium. You don't need to go from 4 to 0. You may only need to go from like 4 to 3. And you might only need to take it from like, 4 liters of fluid to 3 or to 5, depending on which direction you go. It only needs a little nudge. It doesn't need a fucking sledgehammer to come in and just obliterate everything.
Okay, fair. All right. So shall we move on to other additions to consider, non-spicy supplements? Talk us through how, because, okay, we're not talking about what over-the-counter supplements we might want to take for health or growth, or we're talking specifically about peak week. So how might these be adjusted or considered with more focus over peak week, and what might they be?
The easiest one and the most common manipulated one would be caffeine. So we know that caffeine supports diuresis, and if we are, and I know Dean is, and I do, we would be tracking caffeine intake and total intake, not necessarily restricting it per se past the individual's needs, unless there was caning it and tanking it quite hard. But just keeping an eye on that, so that when we come to the position of time of trying to crank up diuresis, we potentially had the option to maybe move caffeine total up by 1.25 or 1.5 times their total daily amount to give that a nudge in the right direction. Obviously, it's dependent on how much they're having. If they're having 800 milligrams of caffeine a day, we're definitely not increasing that total amount, and that might be a bit negative. Yeah, that's the first most easiest one there. And it's also good for management of hunger and appetite. If anyone who knows who's done any kind of aggressive fat loading, like it's not that easy. Like peak week's fun and enjoyable, but sometimes that fat load can hit you quite hard. So caffeine can usually be a good way for mitigating hunger, as it always is through prep.
Yeah. The only caveat to that, I'd say, is or the addition, I should say, not a caveat, is that generally caffeine and diuresis only happens really effectively if the caffeine escalation is novel. So, like George said, this needs to be like controlled, and it has to be novel. Novel meaning the reason why I said 1.25 to 1.5 times is because it's that addition that is novel. It's not the caffeine itself; it needs to be novel though. So, like, keep it as controlled and consistent and steady as possible, like for the 1 or 2 weeks leading in, if you can, so that when you do again nudge in the right direction, it's novel enough that it creates the diuresis that we're looking for. Because otherwise, habitual caffeine use itself is not a diuretic by any means. It has to be
because the body's so adaptable.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, you may escalate caffeine in the last day, say for example 24 hours out. You could also couple that with maybe some water soluble vitamins that we know have to be excreted if they're in excess, and the two simplest ones there that have been shown to be fairly consistent with driving diuresis is your B vitamins. Everybody knows that if you take B vitamins you get Hulk piss. And that's just a good indication to show you that there's a filtration requirement there with those. So if you escalate those up, they will also help drive diuresis. And then some of those B vitamins are also involved with carbohydrate storage and cofactors there too. So you get a double win. Vitamin C, similarly, the only thing you have to be cautious with vitamin C is like excessive use. And especially if you're using like a calcium ascorbate, I think it is. Excessive use in a single dose can also make you want to go to the toilet and shit yourself. So don't overdo that. Usually like 500 to 1,000 milligrams 4 times per day with each meal, for example, is sufficient enough to do the job without it being problematic.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Sorry, George.
I was going to say, I don't know, 4 grams got me quite hard.
I've actually used it before, even for somebody who, like, for example, just like was really struggling to poop. It's like, all right, well, you know, one thing you can do, for example, another one would be like a magnesium oxide. You could use something like this that would actually drive that out without having to use a suppository if you went into that. You know, I shouldn't say if you went into that. It sounds like it's sexual, but you know,
as
maybe
if people are actually into that. Yeah.
Like, sorry, coach, I'd much rather use a suppository if you've got one, if I can.
From now on, every time I send a message telling an athlete to use the glycerin suppository, I'm going to send a message after going, "Oh, I bet you like that."
I know what floats your boat.
Could you imagine? It's like, how'd the suppository go? And they start giving you like a rundown on why it was enjoyable. Like, no, I mean, like, did you go to the toilet, you freak?
Can you imagine?
Oh, good times. It was the back of a vitamin C bottle, I think, was it? And it said, you know, like excessive use, like don't exceed the recommended dose because it can give you the green apple squirts.
No, that was ATP Science. They brought out a creatine, which was, as far as I remember, just fucking the German brand version, Creapure. And it was like, you get the green apple splatters from creatine. They're trying to basically leverage marketing to say that all creatines were shit except for Creapure.
Right, that's what it was.
And yeah, that was what they referred to diarrhea as, the green apple splatters.
Well, what a segue. Talk to us about creatine in peak week.
This is true. I mean, a good addition to a carbohydrate load day. It just helps, again, like it's about nudging things in the right direction, to use that same terminology again. It's gonna help with carbohydrate replenishment. So, you know, your typical sort of 3-ish to 5 grams across multiple meals in the day. It's also like gonna pull some fluid intracellularly. So like you've got some muscular fullness that you're gonna get from fluid there. So there's an artificial, you know, increase in fullness. So it's a double win again.
Okay, cool. Hey, so would you, sorry, just reversing back to caffeine quickly, because Dean, you mentioned it needs to be novel. Would you maybe, if somebody has a high caffeine intake, would you maybe taper them down the weeks leading into peak week so that you can bump it back up, and therefore it be a novel stimulus without, you know, already adding more caffeine on top of an already high caffeine intake?
Yeah, provided it was an adaptation. It was long enough spent at a lower exposure to get the novelty, then yeah.
Yeah, like if somebody was doing like, I think this is what you mean, George. If someone was doing like 200 to 400 milligrams a day for their entirety of their prep, I wouldn't touch it. I'd be like, yep, cool. I can bang that up to 800 milligrams and they'll be fine. But if they were doing 800 milligrams, I'd for sure try and pull that down if they were, if it was possible, you know, because some people really do feel like they need it, you know. So my comment would be, hey, do you reckon we could get this down to 500 for the day for the next couple of weeks? Because if we can, I want to leverage it later on, you know. So yeah, for sure. And similarly, like creatine's going to be like most people are probably going to take a daily dose. So if you want to use it for the load, you kind of need it. They should technically be saturated, but there is also some stuff to suggest that the capacity to sustain saturation with the same dosage repeatedly is maybe a little bit diminished over time. So I would use an otherwise like typical loading strategy on a carbohydrate load day if I was using creatine for that. So it might be like 5 grams 4 times for the day. So 20 grams, like a true original load strategy.
All right. Okay. So let's wrap it up with glycerin. Talk to me.
I've had some fun with this one.
Yeah,
and the biggest thing I'd suggest to people that do want to use glycerin is to watch the total amount and make sure that they are utilizing efficient amount of water in combination to the amount of glycerin, because otherwise your guts will not like you.
Nope.
And I've also experimented in like the max capacity kind of realms of like what we can try and get away with. And I moved right up to like 500 grams with like 3 liters of water before a session and pushed it to its limits. I will say this, the pumps that you can drive and the fullness you can bring with that are pretty insatiable. Like the feeling is next to none. I've used it on athletes on show day and found that somewhere around like 15 to 25 grams is actually more than sufficient enough on a peeled person to actually drive that additional layer of fullness that we're trying to drive into the intracellular space. But yeah, if you do want to experiment, go careful.
Yeah, it's
So
highly
is this
osmotic.
something that you would kind of try in a trial peak week before the actual peak week?
Pre-workout, it tends to be my favorite time. And then you can gauge the post-workout shots on a change in fullness.
Yeah, difficult to get in Oz, except in some pre-workouts. This is the reason why pre-workouts clump as well, or one of the reasons. It's highly osmotic, so it's going to pull fluid, which is what's its advantage is that it's going to drive like blood plasma like volumization, and then you're going to get also like intramuscular fullness from it over time. The problem with this is that if you think about what it does by action is that if it is osmotic and that it pulls fluid, if you don't consume it with the requisite fluid it requires, like George mentioned, that's why you're going to get a bad gut ache, because it's going to pull fluid in there pretty hard. So like it's only suitable for individuals who also can have like a reasonable amount of fluid, say on show day. Because we don't want to be giving somebody a dry scooped fucking pre-workout to get a pump before stage, because it's not going to work, you know. And similarly, like if you had to pull fluid 24 hours out for whatever reason, then it's maybe not suitable. But if you look at any of the numbers like on glycerin, yeah, it's usually in a lot of fluid. So you do need to at least be able to consume the liquid alongside it.
I found the best way to get it in Oz would be to go hairdressers wholesale, and you can buy it for very cheap comparatively to what, and it is medical grade to be consumed as a food ingredient as well. So you can buy it really, really cheap from wholesale from hairdressers.
Well, there's something worth sharing.
100%. Shout out to
How did you
James
figure
Mack.
that one out?
James Mack told
Oh,
me
yeah.
on last season, he was like, bro, don't worry about it, because Alex was showing him this mad black label supplement thing that had like all this special pump formula with glycerin. And he was like, that costs 50 quid. This costs 20 quid. And he pulls out this massive like 2 liter bottle of glycerin, just like, hey, wholesale.
Oh, crazy.
Yeah, otherwise you're buying fucking honey rambods, like glycerin liquid, which is so expensive. And it's like, I don't know, 100 mil of it or some shit. I can't remember, but cool product.
Yeah, I Amazon.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Well, thank you,
much
boys. I think we should. Sorry, I'm just going to move rooms while we talk because someone else needs this call room now, this podcast room. But I would like for you guys to wrap it up with a be less shit tip. Ideally, to do with what we've spoken about today. When it comes to peak weeks and things that we need to manipulate, how might someone be less shit? What is a take-home point?
If you are in doubt as to what to do, move as little variables as possible and keep things as consistent as you can. And that gives you the best chance of at least a 75% consistent with your look.
Yep. Mine would be move one variable at a time, assess, and then try another one if you think it's worth giving a go. I would also say your be less shit tip should be listen to this mainly with interest and not necessarily with like application, because you might hear all of these things and go, oh, I want to try this and this and this and this and this. The reality is that in practice and in application, although we're saying you could do this and you could do this and you could do this, most of the time it's the same for myself, at least. I'm usually only shifting like one or two things in the direction. I'm not messing around with many of them.
Okay, so put it into a pithy sentence. It would be, just because you can, it doesn't mean you should.
Damn.
Okay, wonderful. And something we're sharing, we've already covered that with George's wonderful tip. I might share, I don't know, Dean, if you have something as well. I just put a book review up on my Instagram. It was a book called Do Hard Things. And it's basically a whole book on helping people do hard things, including being successful at an extreme sport like bodybuilding. And I think it has a lot of value for those out there trying to do hard things within the sport. And I described it in my book review as like an anti-Goggins, who I'm not a huge fan of the message, which is just like, I don't know, if you don't work until you piss blood, you're an absolute pussy. He's just like absolutely no self-reflection, like not a fan. So this book is like quite legitimate in the sense that it's like a holistic, mature look at being excellent, and it pulls from psychology and coaching and Buddhism. And so that would be my something we're sharing. You have anything, Dean?
I can't top that. That's good.
Okay, right. I'll put it in the show notes. So now, would you rather, boys, would you rather never be able to eat cream of rice again, which I know you both absolutely love, or only be able to eat cream of rice again if you also eat it alongside dry oats, not oats with like frozen berries where the juice is melted into the oats, just like dry oats alongside your cream of rice?
I will answer while George ponders his life choices, and I will say this: we all think the things that we love we can't live without until we have to live without them for a while, and then you realize that you kind of just pivot and find something else. Having been in Argentina now for 5 months, 5 months, yeah,
it's been 5 months.
Whereby the protein that you may want to buy costs $100 a kilo Australian, or the one that you can buy that costs at a reasonable price tastes pretty fucking average. I've had some very average cores while here, and I could live without them, which means I've had a good one now for 5 months. Doesn't mean that I won't be putting it straight back in when we get back to the UK. But
travel does teach you that, doesn't it? How to live without the things that you think you can't live without.
I haven't had, George, can you imagine this? I have not had like a thick, high protein yogurt in 5 months. Like, there's no
so much.
There's no Chobani here. There's no nut. There's none. There's
no good way.
There's liquid yogurt in a bag that is.
At this point, life is just not worth living. Like the ease of bodybuilder life is gone. What's the point?
Dean and I come back to London soon, and for the last week, we're like, oh, we get this food back and we get that food back. Like, fuck yes, London.
I would probably, in essence, thinking like the quantity of oats, I'm assuming is not going to be astronomical. I will go for it and I'll man it through the oats, because my off season without cream of rice would suck.
Okay.
It's just going to be harder the other way. So, yeah.
Okay. All right. George is eating dry oats. Yeah, love it. Thank you, boys. That was wonderful. We'll see you guys, listeners, boys and girls, in the next episode. Until then, be good to yourself, lift heavy things, and don't eat dry oats.
Peace.